The morning of December 14th, 1942, Station 105, Chelveston Airfield, England. The surgical tent filled with another wounded navigator as Colonel Malcolm Cummings-Grow bent over the operating table, his hands working to remove fragments of German flak from the young man's chest cavity. The metal shards had torn through the leather jacket as easily as paper through cloth. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Grow's mind recorded what his eyes had seen dozens of times before in recent weeks. The trajectory was low velocity. The wound pattern suggested the fragments had already lost most of their energy before impact. If only there had been something, anything, between this young man's skin and the exploding shell fragment outside his bomber. The mathematics were becoming unbearable. Through the surgical tent, Grow could hear another, B-17 landing, engines coughing after crossing the channel from another daylight raid into the heart of Hitler's Reich. In the distance, more ambulances approached. Nearly 70% of the casualties streaming through his field hospital shared the same wound characteristic. Slower-moving missiles, flak fragments that tumbled through the air after anti-aircraft shells burst around American bombers at 20,000 feet. Pieces of the aircraft itself, torn loose by explosions and transformed into deadly projectiles inside the cramped fuselages. The young navigator would survive. Others that day would not. As the surgeon stepped away from the operating table, he made a decision that would alter the mathematics of aerial warfare. These wounds were preventable. The technology to prevent them already had existed for centuries. Someone just needed to ask the right question in the right place. Within months, that question would save the first of what would eventually become thousands of lives. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The collapse of unprotected bomber crews had begun on August 17th, 1942, when the 97th Bomb Group launched the first American heavy bomber mission of the war. 18 B-17 flying fortresses crossed the English Channel to attack the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in occupied France. Major Paul Tibbets led 12 bombers against the primary target, while 6 others flew a diversion mission. All aircraft returned safely. But the relatively light opposition near the French coast would prove deceptive. As the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into German-controlled territory through autumn and winter of 1942, the casualty statistics began telling a grim story that contradicted every assumption about daylight precision bombing. The Americans had arrived in England confident in their doctrine. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with half-inch caliber machine guns, would fight its way through German defences in broad daylight, deliver precision strikes on strategic targets, and return home. No need for the cover of darkness that the Royal Air Force relied upon. American bombers would operate in tight defensive formations, their combined firepower supposedly sufficient to repel fighter attacks. Reality over occupied Europe told a different story. October 1942 brought the first comprehensive analysis of 8th Air Force combat casualties. Medical officers compiled data from every wounded airman who passed through British hospitals. The numbers revealed a pattern that stunned military planners who had expected the primary threat to be German fighter aircraft and their machine guns. Instead, the analysis showed that approximately 70% of all bomber crew wounds resulted from relatively low-velocity projectiles. Not bullets from Focke-Wulf 190s or Messerschmitt 109s, but fragments of exploding anti-aircraft shells and pieces of the bombers themselves torn loose by flak bursts. The men weren't being killed by what planners had prepared for. They were being killed by something entirely different. The flak environment over occupied Europe was unlike anything American air planners had anticipated. German anti-aircraft batteries, called Flugabwehrkanone, or flak, had been developed and refined during years of combat. By late 1942, the Luftwaffe had positioned thousands of guns around strategic targets. The standard 88mm flak gun could fire shells to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. Each shell carried a time delay fuse designed to detonate at a predetermined altitude, transforming the shell casing into hundreds of razor-sharp fragments traveling at lethal velocities. When American bombers flew through flak fields, they entered a three-dimensional killing zone, where the sky itself seemed to tear apart. Black clouds of smoke marked detonation points. Each puff contained thousands of steel fragments, spreading outward in deadly spheres. A bomber formation passing through concentrated flak faced a wall of metal. The fragments would punch through aluminum skin, sever control cables, rupture fuel lines, and tear into human flesh. Colonel Grow understood the medical implications immediately. The October analysis revealed that torso wounds constituted the majority of fatal injuries. Chest wounds accounted for 36% of fatalities among unarmored crews, while abdominal wounds added another 39%. Combined, wounds to the body's core represented 75% of all deaths among bomber crews. The mathematics were straightforward: protect the torso, reduce fatalities, but the solution was not obvious to military planners who had spent decades assuming that personal armor belonged to history, not modern warfare. The United States Army Air Forces had no body armor program in 1942. The concept of personal armor had fallen out of military favor during World War I, when experiments with steel vests proved the weight was prohibitive for infantry soldiers who needed mobility more than protection. But aviation warfare presented different parameters. Bomber crews were already encumbered by oxygen equipment, parachutes, and heavy flying suits. They operated in confined spaces where mobility mattered less than survival. Most critically, they faced a specific threat profile dominated by slower-moving fragments rather than high-velocity bullets. A soldier advancing across no man's land needed to move. An airman sitting in a bomber at 20,000 feet needed to survive. Grow's surgical training gave him insight that military planners lacked. He understood wound ballistics in ways that desk officers did not. A fragment from a flak shell, after traveling 200 yards from the explosion point to the aircraft, had lost most of its initial velocity. Such projectiles, traveling perhaps 500 to 1,000 feet per second, could be stopped by relatively thin steel plate. The same principle applied to fragments of aircraft structure torn loose by explosions. These were not armor-piercing bullets traveling 3,000 feet per second. These were tumbling pieces of metal that had already expended much of their kinetic energy. The question was not whether protection was possible. The question was whether anyone would listen to a surgeon proposing a solution that contradicted decades of military doctrine. In October 1942, Grow submitted a proposal to 8th Air Force Headquarters requesting authorization to develop personal armor for bomber crews. The proposal cited the casualty analysis and included preliminary sketches of a vest incorporating overlapping steel plates sewn into fabric. The design was inspired by historical armor, particularly medieval brigandine armor, which used the same principle of small overlapping plates to provide flexibility while maintaining protection. The initial response from Air Force leadership was skepticism. Weight was the immediate concern. Bomber crews already carried approximately 40 pounds of equipment, including parachutes, oxygen systems, and flying suits. Adding substantial armor seemed impractical. There were also concerns about cost, production capacity, and whether crews would actually wear the equipment in combat. Some officers argued that improving fighter escort capability would be more effective than providing armor. Grow persisted. He proposed a limited field test. Produce a small quantity of armor vests. Issue them to crews. Track the casualty statistics compared to unarmored crews. Let the data prove the concept. It was the argument of a scientist, not a soldier. Show me the evidence. Prove it works. Then we'll talk about implementation. Headquarters authorized the experiment with one critical condition. The armor had to be developed quickly and manufactured outside normal military supply channels. The Army Air Forces lacked the capacity to produce armor domestically on short notice. Standard procurement procedures would take months, perhaps years. Men were dying now. Grow needed a solution that could be fielded in weeks. Grow contacted the British for assistance. The Royal Air Force had experimented with body armour for their own bomber crews, but had encountered obstacles. British bombers, particularly the Avro Lancaster, which formed the backbone of RAF Bomber Command, had extremely cramped crew positions. The confined spaces made bulky armour impractical. RAF armour experiments had been abandoned by late 1942 as unworkable for their aircraft configurations. However, American bombers offered more interior space. The B-17 and B-24, while certainly cramped by any civilian standard, provided slightly more room than the Lancaster. Crew positions in American bombers allowed for equipment that would have been impossible in British aircraft. What didn't work for the RAF might work for the Americans. It was a matter of inches, but those inches meant the difference between feasible and impossible. The British connected Grow with the Wilkinson Sword Company, a firm with a curious pedigree for wartime armour development. Founded in 1772, Wilkinson had built its reputation manufacturing swords, bayonets, and later razors. But the company maintained expertise in metallurgy and had a long history of armour work dating back to the Victorian era, when they produced bulletproof vests for British officers serving in colonial conflicts. During World War I, Wilkinson had manufactured body armour for officers, though the weight made it unpopular. By World War II, the company had shifted most production to aircraft fire suppression systems, but they retained the technical knowledge to work with armour plate. It was an unusual match, a sword company that made razors, partnering with an American military surgeon to develop life-saving equipment for bomber crews. But war makes strange collaborations necessary. Grow travelled to Wilkinson's facility in October 1942 with his preliminary designs and medical data. The collaboration that followed represented an unusual partnership between military medicine and civilian manufacturing. Grow brought his understanding of wound ballistics and human anatomy. Wilkinson contributed expertise in metalwork and production engineering. Together, they refined the design through multiple iterations, each one balancing protection, weight, and flexibility. The final design consisted of 3 separate pieces. The main vest covered the torso, front and back. A separate apron piece protected the lower abdomen and groin. An additional piece could be configured to protect specific crew positions, like the ball turret gunner who faced unique threat angles. Each section incorporated 2-inch square plates of manganese steel, each plate approximately 1 mm thick. The plates overlapped slightly, sewn into pockets within a heavy canvas outer shell backed with soft cotton for comfort. The critical innovation was the manganese steel selection. This alloy provided hardness sufficient to stop or deflect reduced velocity fragments while remaining thin enough to keep weight manageable. Each steel square weighed only a few ounces, but collectively they provided coverage for the torso's vital areas. The complete vest and apron combination weighed approximately 22 pounds, substantial but not prohibitive given the lives at stake. The design included a quick-release mechanism consisting of coloured cords and fasteners. Pulling the red ripcord would instantly jettison the entire armour system, addressing concerns about crews needing to bail out or escape damaged aircraft, and quickly. If a bomber went down and crew members needed to parachute, the last thing they needed was 22 pounds of steel dragging them down. The ripcord solved that problem. One pull, and the armour fell away. By early 1943, Wilkinson had produced prototype armour suits for testing. The prototypes were crude by later standards, but they represented proof of concept, steel plates sewn into canvas, heavy, uncomfortable, but potentially life-saving. Testing began in March 1943, with crews receiving the British-manufactured vests. The early missions with armour showed promising results. Wounded crew members began appearing at field hospitals wearing damaged armour vests that had stopped fragments. Medical officers examined the vests and found flak fragments embedded in steel plates, stopped before penetrating completely. The fragments had lost enough energy travelling from the flak burst to the aircraft that the thin manganese steel was sufficient to defeat them. The theory was proving true in practice. Men who should have been dead were walking away with bruises instead of chest wounds. By spring 1943, demand for the armour suits was beginning to grow. Word spread through 8th Air Force bases across England. Crews returning from missions told stories about the vests saving lives. A waist gunner took shrapnel that punched through the fuselage but stopped in his vest. A navigator survived a direct hit that embedded fragments in the steel plates over his heart. These weren't abstract statistics. These were men telling their friends that the armour worked. The British production capacity through Wilkinson Sword could not meet expanding demand. The company's facilities were already committed to other war production priorities. They could produce perhaps 100 armour suits per month, far short of the thousands needed to equip the expanding 8th Air Force bomber fleet. The 8th Air Force was growing rapidly through 1943. New bomb groups arrived in England monthly. Each group required hundreds of armour suits to equip all crew positions across dozens of bombers. In summer 1943, Colonel Grow worked to arrange domestic production. The War Department authorized immediate production of American-manufactured armour. The contract was unusual in that it involved collaboration between military arsenals and civilian manufacturers, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The museum's armour workshop, staffed by medieval armour experts and skilled craftsmen, became the primary design research facility. These specialists studied historical armour designs, particularly 15th-century brigandine armour, and adapted the principles to modern materials and manufacturing techniques. Stephen Granksay, curator of the Metropolitan Museum's Arms and Armour Department, led the research effort. His 1945 article in the Metropolitan Museum of Art Bulletin described the process. The design of Armour Vest M6, which is the latest standardized flyer's armour, is based on one of the museum's brigandines, dating from about 1400. The suits of armour in the exhibition halls are constantly studied for suggestions, and no type which seems to hold the slightest promise of adaptation is overlooked. Heavy armour for the military sport of jousting, lighter battle armour, shirts of mail, scale armour, and the quilted jackets of Renaissance days have all been carefully examined. The collaboration between medieval armour experts and modern military engineers represented one of the most unusual research partnerships of the war. Museum craftsmen who normally restored priceless historical artifacts were now designing life-saving equipment for bomber crews. The expertise accumulated over centuries of armour development was suddenly relevant again in an age of aerial warfare. Knights who rode into battle wearing steel plates had faced similar problems to airmen flying through flak fields. How do you protect vital areas while maintaining mobility? How do you balance weight against protection? American production began in mid-1943, with multiple facilities producing variations of the basic design. The standardized Mohn vest used nylon fabric instead of canvas for the outer shell, a modification that improved water resistance and durability. The cotton backing was retained for comfort. The steel plates remained the same specification developed with Wilkinson Sword. 2-inch squares of manganese steel, 1 millimeter thick, providing protection against low-velocity fragments. Production rapidly scaled up as manufacturers across the United States began receiving contracts. On October 5, 1943, the Mohn Flyer's vest was officially adopted as standard equipment for all 8th Air Force bomber crews. The authorization memo specified that every combat crew member would be issued armour appropriate to their position in the aircraft. The decision represented a massive logistical undertaking. The 8th Air Force was rapidly expanding in autumn 1943. New bomb groups were arriving in England monthly. Each group required hundreds of armour suits. The logistics of production, shipping and distribution stretched supply chains already strained by global war. But the casualty statistics made the investment necessary. Men wearing armour were surviving wounds that would have killed unprotected crews. The Mohn vest weighed 17 pounds and 6 ounces, lighter than the British Wilkinson model due to improvements in plate arrangement and fabric selection. Pilots and co-pilots, who sat in armoured seats that protected from below, received a modified M2 vest with less rear coverage. Ball turret gunners received the M3 apron designed for the cramped confines of their position. Waist gunners got the M4 apron optimized for standing positions. Bombardiers, navigators, and other seated personnel received M5 groin armour to supplement the main vest. The modular design allowed crews to configure protection based on their specific threat exposure. A pilot sitting in an armoured seat didn't need as much back protection. A ball turret gunner hanging beneath the aircraft in a plexiglass sphere needed protection from every angle. A waist gunner standing by an open window needed coverage for his sides. The system adapted to the reality that not all crew positions faced the same threats. Initial resistance to wearing the armor evaporated quickly once crews experienced it in combat. The weight was noticeable, certainly. 17 pounds added to equipment loads that already included parachutes, oxygen masks, heated suits, and ammunition. But the alternative was bleeding out at 20,000 feet. Crews made the calculation quickly. Better to carry extra weight than die from a fragment that could have been stopped. By early 1944, the armor program expanded to include additional protective equipment. The M3 helmet, developed specifically for bomber crews, provided better shrapnel protection than standard infantry helmets. The helmet used overlapping strips of manganese steel over a leather flying helmet base. The Grow helmet, named after its inventor, featured 5 overlapping steel strips that could stop fragments that would penetrate standard helmet designs. A comprehensive study conducted by 8th Air Force medical officers examined casualty rates comparing armored versus unarmored crews. The study, documented in official Army Medical Department histories, examined 1,117 battle casualties from heavy bombardment groups. The numbers told a story that vindicated Grow's persistence. Among crews not wearing body armor, fatalities from chest wounds were 36% and abdominal wounds 39%. Among armored crews, these dropped to 8% and 7%, respectively, representing a 77.1% reduction in thoracic wound fatalities and 82.1% reduction in abdominal wound fatalities. Additional analysis showed a reduction of 58% in individuals wounded and 60% in total wounds sustained among bomber crews after armor introduction. The armor could not prevent all deaths. Head wounds remained lethal regardless of torso protection. Limb wounds continued to cause casualties. Fragments striking at extreme angles could sometimes penetrate through gaps. Direct hits from larger caliber projectiles could defeat the thin steel plates, but the armor succeeded at its primary mission by stopping the majority of slower-moving fragments that constituted the primary threat to bomber crews. Men who would have died were surviving. Men who would have been wounded were walking away with bruises. The mathematical equation of aerial warfare had changed. The Germans were still firing the same guns, but American crews had better odds of coming home. October 14, 1943, brought the mission that would become known as Black Thursday. The second raid on Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories saw 291 B-17 bombers dispatched. 60 bombers were lost, 17 more damaged beyond repair, and 121 returned with battle damage. The losses were devastating, representing over 20% of the attacking force. Medical officers examining returning crews found that armor had prevented many additional casualties. Crew members displayed damaged vests with fragments embedded in steel plates. Without armor, the casualty toll would have been even higher. But the armor could not overcome the fundamental challenges of daylight strategic bombing in 1943. Even with protection, crews faced overwhelming odds during the darkest months of the air war. Black Thursday proved that body armor alone could not solve the problem of unescorted daylight bombing deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe's fighter force was too strong, the flak too concentrated. Bombers needed fighter escort all the way to the target and back. Until that became possible, missions deep into Germany would continue exacting terrible costs. The turning point for bomber operations came not from armor alone, but from fighter escort. The introduction of P-51 Mustangs, with enough range to escort bombers deep into Germany, changed the tactical balance. Long-range fighters could engage German interceptors before they reached the bomber formations. The Mustang, with drop tanks extending its range, could accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The combination of better fighter escort and body armor created a synergy that improved survival rates dramatically by spring 1944. Fighters kept German interceptors away from the formations. Body armor protected crews from the flak that fighters couldn't prevent. Together, they transformed the odds. Missions that would have been suicidal in 1943 became survivable by mid-1944. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the 8th Air Force had become a mature fighting force. Thousands of aircraft conducted precision strikes against French transportation networks and German defences. The armour programme had equipped virtually all bomber crews. Production had overcome initial shortages. Every man flying into combat had access to protection that had been unavailable just 18 months earlier. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By war's end, 338,780 Moan vests had been produced, along with 95,919 M2 vests. The scale of production represented a massive industrial effort. Factories across America turned out thousands of vests monthly. Each vest required cutting, sewing, and installing hundreds of steel plates. The craftsmanship was repetitive but essential. Each vest potentially saved a life. One of the most remarkable aspects of the armour programme was how quickly it was implemented once the need was recognised. From Colonel Growe's initial analysis in October 1942 to full-scale production by late 1943 took just 1 year. This timeline included design development, prototype testing, contractor selection, production ramp-up, and distribution logistics. The programme also represented effective Allied cooperation. The British provided initial production capacity through Wilkinson Sword. British metallurgists contributed expertise in steel alloys. The United Kingdom supplied 9,600 flak jackets to the United States Army Air Forces under reverse lend-lease. American manufacturers scaled up production using British designs as a foundation. The Metropolitan Museum of Art provided design research that improved the American versions. The collaboration crossed organizational boundaries in ways that were uncommon even in wartime. A British sword company, an American surgeon, a New York museum, and military procurement officers all contributed to a program that saved thousands of lives. The barriers between organizations fell away when the mission was clear enough. Save the crews, nothing else mattered as much. Colonel Malcolm Growe continued his innovations throughout the war. Beyond body armour, he developed better oxygen systems that reduced hypoxia at high altitudes. He pioneered rest homes where combat-stressed crews could recover between missions. He instituted psychiatric screening and support programs that reduced combat fatigue breakdowns. His holistic approach to crew health addressed physical and mental challenges simultaneously. Growe understood that keeping men alive required more than just stopping shrapnel. It required addressing every factor that degraded combat effectiveness. Frostbite from inadequate clothing, hypoxia from poor oxygen systems, mental breakdown from unrelenting stress. Each problem required a solution, and Growe methodically developed those solutions while fighting against bureaucratic resistance at every step. In July 1943, Colonel Growe received the Legion of Merit for developing body armour to protect combat crews. The citation noted that a study of wounds showed nearly 70% were caused by missiles of relatively low velocity, and that he led the way in developing light body armour and steel helmet that saved many lives and materially improved combat crew morale. In May 1944, General Growe was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for developing a device to protect gunners from wind blast, electrically heated clothing, gloves, boots, hand warmers, and casualty bags for wounded, wind and fire-resistant face and neck protectors, and a special combat ration for use on long bombing missions. Frostbite cases decreased and flight efficiency increased. After a study of psychiatric failures in combat, he helped institute rest homes, a new special pass system, and special training for medical officers in tactical units. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. After the war, Growe was appointed acting air surgeon for the Army Air Forces in 1945 and air surgeon in 1946. When the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, the medical service initially remained with the Army. On July 1, 1949, Malcolm Growe became the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force, serving until November 30, 1949. He retired as a Major General on December 1st, 1949. He died on October 20th, 1960, at the age of 72, having lived to see the full flowering of the body armor program he initiated. His death came quietly, without fanfare, but the legacy he left behind continued protecting military personnel decades after his passing. The principles he established, the systems he created, the lives he saved, all echoed forward through time. The lessons learned from the World War II armor program influenced Korean War equipment development. The M1952 vest issued to ground troops in Korea used ballistic nylon instead of steel plates, but followed the same modular design principles. The idea of layered protection, quick release mechanisms, and position-specific configurations all traced back to Grove's work in England a decade earlier. Vietnam-era flak jackets incorporated improved materials but retained the basic concept of flexible armor, providing protection against fragments. The M1969 flak jacket worn by soldiers in Southeast Asia was lighter and more comfortable than World War II versions, but the underlying principle remained unchanged. Protect the torso from low-velocity fragments. Accept that you cannot stop everything, but stop what kills most often. Modern body armor with ceramic plates and Kevlar fabric represents technological advancement but follows the same fundamental approach that Colonel Grove pioneered in 1942. The materials have changed, the engineering is more sophisticated, but the core concept endures. Identify the primary threat, design protection adequate to that threat, make it wearable, issue it as standard equipment. The legacy of Colonel Malcolm Grove's innovation extends into the present day. Every police officer wearing a bulletproof vest, every soldier equipped with body armor, every person whose life has been protected by flexible armor technology owes a debt to the flak vest program of World War II. The connection may not be immediately obvious. Modern armor looks nothing like those, canvas vests with steel plates. But the intellectual lineage is direct and unbroken. Modern body armor has evolved technologically far beyond the Monet Flyer's vest, but the conceptual foundation remains unchanged. Today's ceramic plates and Kevlar fabric are more effective than manganese steel squares sewn into canvas, but they serve the same function by providing protection against fragments and projectiles that would otherwise kill or wound. The question Grove asked in 1942 is the same question armor designers ask today. What kills people most often, and how can we stop it? The story of how one surgeon's development of steel vests saved thousands of lives contains no dramatic battlefield heroics. There are no last stands or impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Instead, it is a story of careful observation, data analysis, creative problem-solving, and bureaucratic persistence. These are not the qualities that usually make for compelling war stories, but they are the qualities that save lives in ways that heroism alone cannot. Colonel Grove saw patterns in the wounds he treated. He connected those patterns to a solution drawn from history. He collaborated with unlikely partners to develop and test that solution. He advocated for adoption despite skepticism. He succeeded because the evidence was undeniable and the need was desperate. His success came not from battlefield courage, but from scientific rigor applied to a military problem. The flak vest program demonstrated that technology can save lives even in the most lethal environments if the right problems are identified and addressed systematically. Protection does not require perfect invulnerability. It requires adequate protection against the most common threats to reduce casualties to acceptable levels. The Monet Flyer's vest could not stop everything, but it did not need to. It needed to stop most fragments most of the time, and that is exactly what it did. The combined bomber offensive exacted a terrible toll. By war's end, the 8th and 15th Air Forces together suffered over 27,000 killed in action and another 9,000 wounded in action. RAF Bomber Command lost over 55,000 men, killed with approximately 18,000 wounded. The scale of the losses underscored the importance of any measure that could improve survival rates. Body armor represented one of the most effective life-saving initiatives of the entire air war, with documented casualty reductions of 60% overall and over 77% for fatal torso wounds. These were not marginal improvements. These were transformative changes in survival probability. A crew member facing a 75% chance of death from a torso wound without armor faced an 18% chance with armor. That difference meant thousands of men came home who would have otherwise been buried in foreign soil or lost forever. The bomber crews who flew through flak-filled skies over Germany in 1944 had dramatically better odds of survival than those who flew the same missions in 1942. Better fighters helped. Improved tactics helped. But body armor helped more than most people realize because it addressed the most common cause of casualties. The threat that killed most often was the threat that armor was designed to stop. Thousands of airmen survived their combat tours and returned home because one surgeon insisted that their wounds were preventable and worked tirelessly to prove it. They went back to farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, colleges across the country. They married, raised families, built careers. Most never knew the name of the man who had made their survival possible, but their lives were his legacy, more enduring than any medal or monument. The Malcolm Grow Medical Center at Andrews Air Force Base is named in his honor, ensuring that future generations of Air Force medical personnel will remember the surgeon who pioneered modern body armor. His innovations in aviation medicine extended far beyond the flak vest. He developed wind blast protection for gunners, electrically heated clothing that reduced frostbite, improved oxygen systems, psychiatric support programs, and rest facilities for combat-stressed airmen. Each innovation addressed a specific problem identified through systematic analysis of medical data. Grow did not rely on intuition or traditional wisdom. He looked at the numbers, identified patterns, and designed solutions based on evidence. This approach, common in medical practice but rare in military procurement, proved extraordinarily effective. The data drove the decisions, and the decisions saved lives. The Metropolitan Museum of Art created exhibits in subsequent decades showing the connection between medieval brigandine armor and modern flak vests. The exhibits displayed a 15th-century brigandine alongside an Monet Flyers vest, demonstrating how the principle of small layered plates had been adapted from ancient armor to modern materials. Museum curators noted that warfare's eternal challenge of protecting soldiers had found new solutions through creative application of historical knowledge. The connection between medieval knights and World War II bomber crews was not immediately obvious. Knights fought on horseback with swords and lances. Airmen fought at 20,000 feet with bombs and machine guns. But both faced the same fundamental problem. How do you protect vital areas from projectiles while maintaining the ability to perform your mission? The answer, separated by 5 centuries, was remarkably similar: layered plates that overlap to provide flexibility and coverage. The Wilkinson Sword Company resumed civilian production after the war, returning to razors and garden tools, but the company retained pride in its wartime contribution to the flak vest program. Company histories published in subsequent decades devoted significant space to the collaboration with Colonel Grow and the development of protective equipment that saved thousands of American lives. For a company known for making razors, it was an unexpected but meaningful legacy. The story of the flak vest development contains lessons that remain relevant decades later. Innovation often comes from unexpected sources. A surgical officer, not a procurement specialist, identified the problem and proposed the solution. A sword manufacturer, not an armor company, provided initial production capacity. A fine arts museum, not a military research lab, supplied critical design expertise. The program succeeded because it drew on diverse sources of knowledge and capability. The program also demonstrated the value of data-driven decision-making. Colonel Grow's initial proposal rested on solid medical statistics. Testing provided clear evidence of effectiveness. Expansion to full production was justified by casualty reductions in units using armor. At every stage, decisions were based on evidence rather than assumption. This rigorous approach overcame skepticism and bureaucratic resistance. Perhaps most importantly, the program showed that lives could be saved through protective technology even in lethal environments. The conventional wisdom in 1942 held that bomber operations over Germany were simply going to be bloody. High casualties were assumed to be inevitable. The mathematics of war seemed immutable. You flew into flak fields, some of you died, and there was nothing to be done about it. Colonel Grow rejected this fatalism. He believed that better protection could reduce casualties, even if it could not eliminate them entirely. His belief, backed by medical evidence and engineering expertise, proved correct. The mathematics could be changed. The odds could be improved. Lives that would have been lost could be saved. It required effort, persistence, and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, but it was possible. The flak vest stands as one of the most successful rapid military innovations of World War II. From problem identification in October 1942 to full implementation by late 1943 represents an exceptionally fast timeline for a program that required new equipment, design, testing, contract negotiation, production scaling, and distribution logistics. Modern procurement programs take years to accomplish what Grow's team did in months. The success resulted from clear evidence of need, practical solution design, effective collaboration between military and civilian entities, and unwavering support from Air Force leadership, who recognized that protecting crews was essential to sustaining the bombing campaign. When the mission was clear and the evidence was compelling, bureaucratic barriers fell away. The system moved quickly because lives depended on speed. In the annals of military medicine, Colonel Malcolm Grow's development of body armor for bomber crews represents a triumph of systematic observation and evidence-based innovation. He saw patterns in the casualties he treated, identified a preventable cause, designed a practical solution, proved its effectiveness through testing, and persevered until it became standard equipment. Each step followed logically from the previous one, but the cumulative effect was transformative. His work established principles that continue protecting military personnel and law enforcement officers today. The fundamental concept remains unchanged. Identify the threat, design appropriate protection, balance weight against effectiveness, test in actual conditions, issue as standard equipment. These principles apply whether you are designing armor for medieval knights, World War II bomber crews, or modern infantry soldiers. The mathematics of aerial warfare were altered fundamentally by the introduction of body armor. Before armor, approximately 36% of crews struck by fragments to the chest died. After armor, that mortality rate dropped to 8%. The improvement in survivability changed bomber crew psychology, tactics, and ultimately contributed to the outcome of the air campaign. Crews who believed they had a reasonable chance of surviving their tours flew with more confidence. The armor did not make them invulnerable, but it changed the calculation from probable death to possible survival. That psychological shift mattered. Men who expected to die flew differently than men who expected to survive. The armor affected morale as much as it affected casualty rates. Commanders could plan more aggressive missions knowing that crew loss rates were manageable. The armor did not eliminate the need to be careful with how bomber forces were employed. Deep penetration missions without fighter escort remained extremely costly, even with armor. But armor expanded the range of missions that could be conducted with acceptable losses. It gave commanders more options. The story serves as a reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected places, that bureaucratic systems can be navigated when the stakes are clear, that collaboration across boundaries produces better results than isolated efforts, and that data-driven decisions lead to better outcomes than assumptions. These are not uniquely military lessons. They apply to any large organization facing complex problems. Most importantly, it reminds us that individuals can make differences that echo through generations. One surgeon working with a sword company and a museum created a solution that saved thousands of lives and changed how militaries think about protecting their people. Malcolm Grow did not command armies. He did not win battles. He simply looked at wounded men and asked whether their wounds could have been prevented. In their transformation from concept to reality lay not just the salvation of individual airmen, but the validation of a principle that remains vital today. That careful observation, creative thinking, and persistent advocacy can overcome even the most daunting challenges when lives hang in the balance. That is the enduring legacy of Colonel Malcolm Grove's Flak Vest program, a testament to what one determined individual can accomplish when armed with data, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those who serve. The young navigator Grow operated on in December 1942 survived his wounds and returned to duty. By spring 1943, that navigator was wearing one of the first production armor vests. He completed his tour of 25 missions and went home to Kansas. He never knew that the surgeon who saved his life had also designed the armor that protected him through the rest of his missions. But the connection was there, invisible and unacknowledged, like thousands of other connections between Grove's work and the men who survived because of it. Decades after the war, veterans would gather at reunions and tell stories about close calls, flak that should have killed them but stopped in their vests, fragments that embedded in steel plates inches from their hearts. They did not usually mention Colonel Grove by name. Most had never heard of him. But they remembered the vests. They remembered the weight, the discomfort, and the feeling of relief when they realized the armor had saved them. In air museums across America, you can still see those vests, canvas or nylon shells, yellowed with age, steel plates visible through tears in the fabric. Sometimes there are fragments still embedded in the plates, frozen in place where they stopped 70 years ago. Museum visitors walk past them quickly, more interested in the aircraft or the weapons. But those vests represent something more profound than most displays. They represent the moment when someone looked at a problem differently and changed the outcome for thousands of people. The principle of questioning assumptions, of asking whether accepted losses were truly unavoidable, of looking for solutions in unexpected places, these remain as relevant today as they were in 1942. Every preventable death should prompt the same question Grow asked. Could this have been stopped? Is there a solution we are not seeing because we have accepted the status quo? Modern warfare continues generating casualties. Modern medicine continues working to prevent them. The technologies change, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do you protect people operating in lethal environments? The answer requires the same combination of scientific rigor, creative thinking, and bureaucratic persistence that Grow demonstrated. The specific solutions will be different. The approach should be the same. The Flak Vest program succeeded because one person refused to accept that 70% of casualties were inevitable. He looked at the data and saw preventable deaths. He studied history and found solutions. He overcame resistance and proved his case. The thousands of men who survived because of his work never had to know his name. Their survival was testament enough. Their lives were the proof that questioning assumptions and demanding better solutions can change outcomes that seem immutable. In the end, that is what makes Colonel Malcolm Grove's story worth remembering. Not because he was a hero in the traditional sense, charging machine guns or flying impossible missions, but because he demonstrated that careful thinking applied persistently can save lives in ways that bravery alone cannot. The surgeon, who operated on wounded men in a tent in England, changed the mathematics of aerial warfare with steel plates and canvas. That transformation, quiet and methodical, saved more lives than most battlefield victories. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.